My good friend and mentor, Steve Brown, recently turned 80, and it made me think about all the ways he's impacted my life. He's been my teacher, bandmate, boss, and friend since 1979, and I know that if it wasn't for Steve Brown, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. It's a good story. Steve was my guitar teacher at Ithaca College from 1981 until 1984. And Steve was an incredibly good jazz guitar player. He had amazing time. He directed the big band. He was a really inventive melodic player. He taught me so much about phrasing. He also taught me about the importance of ear training. Steve had a phenomenally good ear and was one of the best solfege singers that I had ever heard. He could read any big band chart and do the solfege syllables to it. Just really talented guy. And it blows my mind that Steve is 80 years old now. The first time I ever sat in on a jazz gig was in the Ithaca Commons. There was this indoor food court area, and Steve was playing midday. He had a gig there, and he said, "Why don't you come down and sit in?" I was a junior at the time, and I was so nervous. I was, going to go and play with Steve. He was with a quartet. So I bring my guitar down, my ES 335, to the gig. Steve has a Walter Woods head, and it had 4 inputs, so I plugged into another input, so we were both playing through the same amp, and we played the song Stella by Starlight. Steve said, "You did a great job." And Steve was not one to be complimentary, really. He was a tough guy, but one of the greatest guys you'll ever meet. And then he hired me to play a gig with him, a duo gig, that same year, later that year. And we went to Elmira, New York, and we played this duo gig together. And Steve was so complimentary of me. And just to play with my teacher, there were no other students that were playing that Steve asked to play on a gig with. And so I ended up graduating from Ithaca College, and I went to New England Conservatory to study with Mick Goodrick there. I came back to Ithaca because I was thinking about going to New York City to try to make it as a jazz player. This is in the very beginning, January, February of 1987. I go back to Ithaca to visit my friend Tom Wadsworth. He lived in a house with 2 other guys, Dave Jacobs and Kenny Schiff. So these guys, we used to call it the outhouse. They put up 2 sheets in the doorways of the living room, and I slept on the couch. Tom's like, "You can stay as long as you want." So the first day I'm there, I go over to this place, The Haunt, and I talk to a guy, John Peterson, and I said, "Hey, I want to play a gig. Do you have any gigs available?" He said, "Yeah. Matter of fact, you can come in and play tomorrow night if you want. We had a cancellation." Okay. So I called up my buddy Pete Schwazik to play bass, Tom Killian played drums, and hired Steve to play guitar. So it was 2 guitars, bass, and drums. So I get to the gig, and just to freak out Steve, I wore a weird hat, sunglasses, and a bathrobe. Now, don't ask me why, and I'm playing a Fender Strat. As a matter of fact, this is a picture of me from that gig. So I come in, and we play, and we're playing all these standards, and Steve's, at the end of the gig, he said, "Man, you just sound amazing." And he said, "I want to ask you something. I spoke with the dean yesterday, and in the fall, we're going to add a second position teaching jazz studies." Now, Steve was really the jazz studies department. It was just him. He taught all the classes, all the improv classes, all of the guitar lessons, directed the big band. So they were going to add somebody to teach with him. And he wanted it to be me. And he said, "Listen, you don't have to let me know now, but think about it and let me know in a couple weeks." So I asked my friends, talked to my parents, "What do you think? Should I do this thing? Teaching? It's kind of weird being teaching at Ithaca. I mean, I just graduated 2 years before from there." So I decided to take the gig. I taught there from 1987 to 1992. During that time period, I played more gigs with Steve than anyone that I've ever played with in my life, which is amazing that in 1,110 videos that I've done, this being the 1,110th, that I haven't really talked about this. By the way, if you're new to the channel or a returning viewer and haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button now, before I forget. We played together as a duo every Wednesday in the Ithaca College pub. All of our students would come in, all the guitar students, all the jazz students come and play. We'd play originals, we'd play standards. Then we had a band called Milestones, where Steve played drums. Steve was a great drummer. We had a bass player, Jim Gannon, upright player, that had played with Charlie Parker. great bass player, amazing feel, and Chris Prasad, who was a trumpet player and one of my best friends, one of my old college roommates, just incredible. So we were called Milestones, and we played all over the place. We didn't just play in Ithaca, we traveled to Corning, to Elmira, and then Steve and I had another group with my friend Paul Smith, or Smitty, that I talked about in the Most Complex Pop Song of All Time video. Smitty played piano, and Steve played bass, and I played guitar. Honestly, one of the few recordings that I had, which I don't have anymore, was a gig that we did, a trio gig that we did for this place that Paul and I taught, called 171 Cedar Art Center in Corning. I did a recital there with Paul and Steve, and I got a recording of it. When my dad passed away, I put the CD in with my dad in the coffin because it was the only original jazz recording that I had. I never went into recording studios. You didn't do that back then. I left Ithaca in 1992 in May. The last gig that Steve and I did together, which was actually my last jazz gig, was in the end of 1991. I've seen him a couple times since then. Steve still lives in Ithaca. He retired in 2008, so he taught there from 1968 to 2008, 40 years. Amazing. When I was in my second year teaching there, I wrote my Beato book. And Steve was really encouraging about doing that. I told him, I said, Steve, I want to write a book to use with my students, with my concepts. He said, you should definitely do that. And I worked on it for 10 months and wrote it. I had it bound, Xeroxed, and my students would buy it and use it for their lessons. So Steve was really important for that as well. I wanted to honor him in a video today, his 80th birthday from 2 days ago, and just say what an important person Steve is. Steve has a record out that I went and re-listened to called Good Lines. It's on Spotify. He doesn't even have his own real Spotify channel, which he should, but it's because there's so many Steve Browns. The opening track is called Outstanding. I'm gonna play a little bit. That's Steve on guitar, Bill Dobbins on piano, Steve Gilmore on bass, I think, and Bill Goodwin on drums. Oh, nice. So tasteful. Great feel. Now you can tell that Steve is influenced by Wes, Barney Kessel, Jim Hall. Incredible phrasing, though. He taught me so much about how to play over changes, how to play melodically, how to develop ideas, how to end a phrase. And it really developed my playing more than really studying with anyone else. So this video is dedicated to Steve Brown. Steve, thank you so much for everything that you did and being so encouraging during my development as a student and as a teacher back in Ithaca.